No joke, man. It's a rundown piece of no man's land in the middle of a tourist paradise. It goes way back to the old lease agreement between Great Britain and China. Once you step out of the sunlight into the narrow corridors, it's time to protect your nuts, guys.
Kowloon, Hong Kong, the Kowloon Walled City emerged as one of the most peculiar landscapes of the 20th century. A sprawling ecosystem of over 50,000 residents, compressed into a modest 6.5-acre plot, was once regarded as the most densely populated city on planet Earth. To place this in context, let's compare the Kowloon Walled City to other dense urban environments. Consider Manila, an urban metropolis in the Philippines, often regarded as one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Manila, with its skyscrapers and bustling streets, has a population density of around 130,370 people per square mile, a figure that pales in comparison to the overwhelming density of Kowloon Walled City. Even Dharavi, one of the most densely populated slums in India, with a density of about 280,000 per square mile, cannot approach the level seen in Kowloon.
I want to give you a sense of how dense it was. Here's the density of LA, New York, Hong Kong, and Kowloon Walled City. And it almost tripled in population in just a few decades. So how did this happen?
The size of Kowloon Walled City is a challenge to our very perception of space. It was, in truth, about the size of a single city block, smaller than the playing field at Fenway Park, shorter even than a runway at Logan Airport. But within that space, life was stacked layer upon layer, floor upon floor, in a vertical maze of human indecency.
Die Zahl ihrer Einwohner wird auf 50.000 geschätzt. Um sie aufzunehmen, hat man Haus auf Haus in die Höhe gebaut, hat die Straßen verbaut. Denn die ganze Stadt hat nur eine Grundfläche von 2,5 Hektar. Nur einige hundert ihrer Einwohner haben das Glück und das Geld, an den Außenmauern der illegalen Stadt ihre Wohnkäfige anbringen zu können. Hinter den Käfigen befindet sich meist nur ein Zimmer, 10 bis höchstens 20 Quadratmeter groß. Denn Wohnraum in der Walled City ist kostbar, ist unersetzbar.
This is 3.7 meters squared. The average living space per person for a house in the US is 26 times greater than this.
But if you lived in these few blocks of Hong Kong during the early 90s, known as the Kowloon Walled City, this is the average living space that you would have to yourself.
Kowloon Walled City traces its origins back to the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 AD, when a small military outpost was established to defend the area from pirates and monitor the trade routes along the Pearl River. By the 18th century, China, now under the Qing Dynasty, was one of the world's most prosperous and powerful nations. The country had a large population, a highly productive agricultural economy, and was a major center of global trade. During this period, China was largely self-sufficient and had little interest in foreign goods, while European demand for Chinese products, such as tea, silk, and porcelain, was growing rapidly. As a result, a substantial trade imbalance emerged, which heavily depleted the British treasury. As a response to the trade imbalance, British merchants, primarily through the British East India Company, began exporting large quantities of opium from India to China in the late 18th century. Opium, a highly addictive narcotic, was in high demand in China, despite being illegal. The British saw opium as a lucrative commodity that could be used to balance the trade deficit with China, as it allowed them to purchase Chinese goods with the profits from opium sales rather than with silver. The flow of opium into China led to widespread addiction and social unrest, which was a cause of concern for the Qing government. Chinese officials repeatedly requested the British to stop the opium trade, but their pleas were ignored. British merchants continued to smuggle opium into China, doing so with the approval of their own government. From an economic standpoint, the British use of opium to balance the trade deficit was driven by the need to protect their financial interests and maintain their economic dominance in Asia. The British East India Company and the British government were well aware of the devastating effects of opium addiction on Chinese society, but they prioritized economic gain over ethical considerations. By the early 19th century, the opium trade between British merchants and Chinese consumers had reached alarming levels, causing widespread addiction and significant social and economic problems in China. In response to the growing crisis, a vigorous campaign against opium dealers and users was launched in March 1839. Mass arrests of Chinese opium traders were ordered, and demands were made to foreign merchants to surrender their opium stocks. When British merchants refused to comply, over 20,000 chests of opium, approximately 1.2 million kilograms, were confiscated from British warehouses in Canton. In a dramatic public display, the opium was destroyed by dissolving it in water and lime before finally being flushed out into the sea. This act of defiance against foreign interests was celebrated in China, but infuriated the British government and merchants, who saw it as a direct assault on their property and economic interests. British merchants and officials, angered by the loss of their valuable cargo and the Chinese government's brash display of assertiveness, pressured the British government to take military action. The British government, which was already concerned about protecting its trade interests and asserting its imperial authority, decided to use force to compel China to open its markets and compensate for the destroyed opium. In November 1839, the first military encounters between British and Chinese forces occurred, and by 1840, Britain had officially declared war, sending a naval expedition to the Chinese coast. This marked the beginning of the First Opium War. This war ended with a British victory in the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. The treaty was heavily favorable to British interests and was comprised of several provisions, which included the cession of Hong Kong Island to Britain. In 1847, the walled city, which was already established as a military outpost, was further fortified with reinforced walls and watchtowers as part of a broader effort to assert and maintain Chinese authority in the region amidst the growing British influence. The walled city was strategically located to oversee the salt trade and maintain control in an area where British presence was expanding. Unresolved issues from the First Opium War eventually led to the Second Opium War in 1856, as the British and French governments sought greater trade and diplomatic privileges. This war concluded in 1860 with another victory for the British, this time resulting in the official legalization of the opium trade in China and British control over the Kowloon Peninsula, with the exception of the Kowloon Walled City. Though technically under the control of the Qing government, it should be noted that neither British colonial authorities nor the Chinese government took responsibility for the walled city's administration. The walled city lost much of its strategic and military significance and became largely overlooked by the Chinese authorities, while the British placed a greater focus on the walled city's surrounding areas. The walled city's status as a semi-autonomous area meant it was often less scrutinized by authorities, and by the mid-20th century had become known as a settlement for the impoverished and displaced. During the Second World War, Japanese forces occupied Hong Kong from December 25, 1941 until August 15, 1945. During the occupation, Kowloon, including the walled city, was under Japanese control, and the Japanese administration implemented martial law and military governance throughout the territory. The walls of the walled city were also torn down, as stone materials were needed for the expansion of Kai Tak Airport's runways. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Hong Kong was returned to British control. The war had left China with a crippled economy, widespread poverty, and social disorder, all of which was further exacerbated by an ongoing internal conflict between the nationalist government and the Communist Party of China. The political turmoil from the Chinese Civil War and the eventual victory of the Communist Party created a climate of significant political instability. Many individuals, particularly those who were politically aligned with the nationalists or were otherwise opposed to the communist regime, sought refuge in more stable regions. Hong Kong, under British colonial rule, offered relative stability and economic opportunities compared to the rapidly changing and unstable conditions in mainland China. This period of political reform led to a significant increase in migration to Hong Kong. As the walled city was a largely unregulated territory, it became an especially attractive option for those seeking access to affordable shelter, relative isolation from authorities, or even those looking to engage in informal and illicit economic activity. The population estimates for Kowloon Walled City around 1950 vary, and this discrepancy may be due to differing interpretations of available data. The population in 1950 reported to range between 3,000 and 4,000 individuals, or 3,500 families. Either way, this number would have ballooned dramatically by 1964, with estimates suggesting the city's inhabitants had swollen to approximately 30,000 people. Given the walled city's restricted surface area, much of its expansion occurred vertically. Since the walled city operated beyond the jurisdiction of Hong Kong's regulatory framework, the enforcement of conventional building codes, safety standards, and zoning ordinances were conspicuously absent. The only notable enforced regulation was a height restriction of approximately 14 stories. This constriction was imperative to safeguard air traffic due to the walled city's close proximity to Kai Tak Airport. As many of the buildings were constructed without formal authorization, individuals or families often began as squatters of makeshift structures on land they did not technically own. It became common practice for new arrivals to construct their own buildings or extend existing structures, effectively claiming ownership of the newly created or modified space. Over time, these informal constructions became semi-permanent, and residents who built or occupied these areas were regarded as the property owners. The lack of government regulation also provided many opportunities for the business sector. The low cost of rent and absence of regulatory oversight made it possible for many residents to operate small businesses out of their homes or street-level shops, allowing producers to avoid additional costs related to taxes, permits, and regulatory compliance. These included food production, garment workshops, and traditional Chinese medicine practitioners. The location also provided access to a concentrated consumer base within the walled city, along with having a relatively close proximity to Hong Kong's economic centers. Though many of these products produced in the walled city did not meet regulatory and health standards, the affordability of the goods made them an appealing option to many consumers and businesses.
Dieser Mann erzeugt Teigblätter für die beliebten chinesischen Frühlingsrollen. Ein Ein-Mann-Betrieb. Aber der eine Mann funktioniert wie ein computergesteuerter Roboter, trägt auf die heißen Platten Teig auf mit größter Fertigkeit. Jedes Mal so dünn und delikat, wie es sein soll. Und das unablässig, Stunde um Stunde. Auch er arbeitet 12 Stunden am Tag. Der Mann ist billiger als ein Roboter. Er lebt, aus welchen Gründen auch immer, illegal in der illegalen Stadt. Die Ware, die er erzeugt, ist daher ungemein billig. Und vornehme Gaststätten sind Bezieher seiner Erzeugnisse. Sie lassen sich den Sonderprofit nicht entgehen. Einen solchen Trog voll Teig verarbeitet der Mann in einem halben Tag zu tausenden Oblaten für Frühlingsrollen. Die Mitbewohner haben sich längst an ihn gewöhnt. Und er auch längst an sie.
係我咁大個仔試過一次嘅。離開咗城寨之後咧，我有一樣嘢見唔翻嘅喺香港，未見過九龍城寨啲老鼠咁大隻啊！呢個係一個特色嚟嘅。九龍城寨啲老鼠大隻到咧，可以同啲貓媲美嘅。貓有貓揾食，老鼠有老鼠揾食。我哋有我哋派信。我未見過啲老鼠大隻到個肚腩拖地嘅，掂到個地下嘅，好大隻，相當大隻一啲老鼠。
One of the most unique sectors of the walled city's business economy was its healthcare services. Often administered by unlicensed medical practitioners, This includes services provided by dentists, doctors, traditional medicine practitioners, and even surgeons. Due to the lack of regulatory oversight, many of these service providers were not only unlicensed, but also unqualified. It should be noted that this was not always the case, as there were experienced and otherwise qualified practitioners operating within the walled city. Hong Kong's strict licensing regulations made obtaining medical licenses difficult and costly. Many of the practitioners had migrated from mainland China during the civil conflict, and their certifications were not recognized by the colonial government of Hong Kong. Language and cultural barriers also created difficulties when attempting to obtain licenses in an English-dominated, British-controlled city like Hong Kong. Illicit and illegal activities were another crucial sector of the walled city's economy. Organized crime had been conducting business in the walled city since the 1920s and had expanded operations significantly by the 1960s. The lack of government oversight and police intervention allowed the organizations to operate with impunity and without any concern for significant interference from authorities. The opium epidemic remained prevalent in Hong Kong even after the establishment of the People's Republic, with numerous opium dens functioning within the walled city. Gambling has long been a cultural practice in Chinese society, as ideologies of fate and fortune are deeply rooted in traditional philosophical concepts. Mahjong parlors, card games, lotteries, and sports betting were among the various gambling activities in the walled city.
閣下就係紅爺啦，係嘛？
冇錯。
紅爺今日叫我嚟，有乜吩咐咧？
我最中意同啲年青後輩賭翻一手。
賭就無謂啦，不如我係咁意露翻一手，大家算咧。
露一手。呢隻雪花粉飛都幾特別噃。
錯，係仙女散花，大家發財。
By the 1970s, the Kowloon Walled City became infamous for its extensive network of brothels. The high demand for sex workers coincided with the large population of men working in low-range, transient jobs in and around the city. The presence of law enforcement in regulated areas of Hong Kong made the Kowloon Walled City an appealing location for those looking to expand their business operations in the sex trade. Brothels ranged from upscale operations catering to wealthier clients to modest setups in smaller apartments serving the lower end of the market. Women often worked in cramped, unsanitary conditions, and there was little concern for their well-being. It should be noted that some of the sex workers were not participating voluntarily, as human trafficking from mainland China or other parts of Asia was prevalent. The organized crime syndicates played a key role in the trafficking of women into the walled city, as well as managing the brothels. Many of the brothels operated under the guise of tea houses, massage parlors, or other legitimate businesses to further conceal their operations in an already lenient regulatory environment. Brothels often advertised their services using coded language or symbols, such as specific lighting or window displays, to signal the nature of their business to potential customers while evading police scrutiny, though most people familiar with the area were well aware of the true nature of these establishments. The legend of the Kowloon Walled City has had a profound impact on popular culture and has become a source of fascination for artists, filmmakers, and writers worldwide. The most iconic representation of the Kowloon Walled City in popular culture is its depiction in the 1988 masterpiece, Bloodsport, the setting of the mythical Kumite fighting tournament.
So Jean-Claude, tell me about Bloodsport.
It's a long story.
Oh no.
It's about a secret fight, secret event happening every 5 years with the best fighter all over the world in Hong Kong.
So Bloodsport is about some secret fight?
All the best fighter all over the world for each different country. Karate, sumo, Thai boxer, boxing, karate, everything. And the best win the event.
Nowhere else on Earth could such an event, steeped in the shadows of underground martial arts, have found its ideal setting. The walled city's unique atmosphere was essential to the essence of the Kumite, a tournament where the strongest and the most cunning could prove themselves, unbound by the rules that governed the rest of the world. The Kowloon Walled City was more than just a setting for the Kumite. It was an absolute integral part of its identity. The Kowloon Walled City exhibit at the Kawasaki Warehouse Retro Arcade in Japan was a unique and immersive recreation of the infamous Kowloon Walled City, designed to give visitors a visceral experience of what life might have been like living behind the walls. This exhibit, nestled in the Kawasaki Warehouse, managed to recreate aspects of the walled city's architecture using materials imported directly from Hong Kong. The exhibit can be seen as part of a broader trend of urban archaeology, where modern spaces attempt to preserve and interpret the remnants of lost urban environments. Kawasaki Warehouse closed its doors in November 2019, and with it, the Kowloon Walled City exhibit was also dismantled. Video games have also drawn heavily from Kowloon Walled City's unique aesthetic and atmosphere. One of the most notable examples is the Shenmue II game, which includes a meticulously recreated version of the walled city. The game was released in Japan and Europe for the Sega Dreamcast in 2001. The developer's attention to detail in replicating the city's maze-like structure serves as a powerful narrative device. Players navigating the walled city are immersed in an environment that mirrors the challenges faced by its actual residents. The disorientation, the constant movement, and the sense of a world that is self-contained, operating by its own rules. The decision to include Kowloon Walled City in the game is a deliberate nod to its significance as a cultural and historical icon. By embedding the main character's story arc within this setting, the game invites players to explore not just a physical space, but a living memory, preserved through digital recreation. Shenmue 2 offers players a chance to engage with a piece of history that, in the real world, no longer exists. Another well-known video game example is Call of Duty Black Ops. Released in 2010, it features a multiplayer map available as a downloadable content pack. The map's design emphasizes verticality, tight spaces, and the sense of a densely packed urban area, much like the real-life characteristics of the walled city. The Kowloon's Curse franchise are a series of turn-based RPG games reminiscent of Japanese RPGs from the late 90s and early 2000s. These influences are evident in the first-person dungeon crawler gameplay, where players navigate a world that feels both claustrophobic and endlessly complex, mirroring the dense, maze-like nature of the real-life Kowloon Walled City. Mr. Pumpkin 2, Walls of Kowloon, is an adventure puzzle game released on the Steam platform. The developers have reimagined the walled city through a surreal and whimsical lens, blending historical elements with fantastical ones to create a unique experience that pays homage to the real-life location while also taking creative liberties. Welcome to Kowloon is a horror-based adventure game where the main protagonist attempts to mitigate ever-rising housing costs by searching for an apartment to rent within the walled city. Welcome to Kowloon is one of the many games available that utilize the Unity gaming engine, a cross-platform game engine developed by Unity Technologies, first released in 2005. Ghost in the Shell is a 1995 animated film that is inspired by the aesthetic and atmospheric design of the Kowloon Walled City. These urban landscapes in the film create a dystopian backdrop that enhances the story's exploration of identity and humanity within a technologically dominated world. Ghost in the Shell offers a conceptualization of a networked society where the boundaries between human consciousness and artificial intelligence become indistinguishable. The walled city, with its dense, self-contained society, reflects the larger societal issues explored in the film, including the consequences of rapid urbanization, the erosion of traditional structures, and the emergence of new forms of identity and community. The cyberpunk aesthetic and themes have been heavily influenced by the urban environment of Kowloon Walled City. Cyberpunk is a genre characterized by dystopian futures, high-tech advancements, and gritty, congested urban environments, much like the chaotic and densely packed landscape of Kowloon Walled City. The psychological atmosphere of oppression and isolation is prevalent in many examples of cyberpunk media. Kowloon Walled City, with its chaotic environment and lack of formal governance, draws clear parallels to the cyberpunk genre, where societal breakdowns and the struggle for control create similarly bleak and oppressive settings. On January 14, 1987, the governments of Hong Kong and China had reached a joint agreement to proceed with plans for the walled city's demolition. The announcement was met with a great deal of resistance from the 33,000-plus residents at the time. As such, a $350 million compensation and relocation plan was developed. Compensation packages for residents and property owners included financial payouts, along with assistance with relocation to public housing. On average, the financial payout for each tenant was the equivalent to around $4,000 to $6,500 US, and around $9,000 to $13,000 for property owners. Financial payouts to criminal organizations remain undisclosed at this time. The demolition of the walled city occurred between March 1993 and April 1994. The area was transformed into what is now known as Kowloon Walled City Park, which officially opened in December 1995.